3, 2. Baracku Obamovi během prezidentské kampaně Parag Khanna. Parag, good afternoon. Great to have you again. We're doing great. Parag, let me ask a first question that relates to none of the things we usually discuss, even though during our last discussion we did so, of course, and that is COVID. Right now in the Czech Republic, the cases are spiking again all over the world. The problem continues. And of course, the discussion, what does it mean for the world, comes with it. So for you, global citizen, person that knows essentially all the countries on the planet, what does it mean? To what extent and how is it going to change our lives? And now I'm talking about us as citizens, us as business people, us as politicians, people who are actually in a position of leaders, no matter what does it mean in particular.
Well, first of all, thank you. It's very nice to see you. Pleasure to join you. I wish that I could be there in person, of course. But that is obviously one example of how COVID has changed our lives. And I'll tell you from a personal standpoint, it's interesting that before COVID, I always had to choose one or maximum 2 countries that I would go to in a week. But now, of course, I can be in 5 countries in a single day. And that's the power of Zoom. Now, of course, it's quite a different meaning to being somewhere because I'm not actually there, which is unfortunate. But of course, the best, one makes the best of it and makes the most of it, which is to say, at least I now get to speak to you, learn from you, exchange ideas, get a sense of what's going on from people that I trust, and do so on a regular basis. And I think that that is one of the slightly positive attributes. Of course, I'm a traveler. So for me, the priority is always to be there and to contrast the things that I read, the things that I hear with my own on-the-ground views. So now that I've gotten back to that in the last couple of months, it's been very invigorating. So now, in a way, you can imagine in the post-pandemic world, we will perhaps have the best of both worlds, in the sense that you can travel, you can go and discover and explore and validate ideas, and also, of course, have the benefits of digital connectivity and conversations much more regularly. And so I think that we need to look on the bright side, if you will. We all know we can quantify the damage, the devastation, the tragedy of COVID, the number of people who died, the impact on the economy, the soaring volumes of debt, political instability, limitations on migration, supply chains that have been cut off. We know those things. We see them every day. Some of them were preventable. The most important thing is that we learn how to not repeat those mistakes and that we build back better, which is, of course, a phrase that is being used a lot these days. Let me give you one example of something that I think will be what we will do in terms of building back better that relates to mobility and travel. If you notice now, you have a QR code that validates your vaccination status. Now, we have not used QR codes for international travel. We use our passports, of course. But now think about the specific data that you are providing to be given permission to travel. Your itinerary, your travel history, your medical status, your education history, financial records, criminal history. Why do we not have a QR code that links to our blockchain account or vault where this information is updated and validated, and that is simply shared when needed to gain access to another country? So right now we live in a world where hundreds of millions of people have to go and maybe even fly or walk or drive to a neighboring country to find a consulate or an embassy of a country and then spend hundreds of dollars to do paperwork and applications to hopefully gain access to a country. In the post-pandemic world, this will be an app, and you will push a few buttons, you will share documents, and that country will say yes, no, and it will be much more efficient. So let's think about all of the things that we are going to do better.
Just a technical issue here. Všichni rozumíte? Poprosím. Mohli bychom to jenom trošičku tu hlasitost zvýšit? Just issue of volume here, sorry, Parag. Okay, let's focus on Asia in particular. Of course, you're talking to us from Singapore. To what extent is Asia changing? And, you know, it is a highly relevant question, given that, for instance, it is so difficult to get to China, and we have a Chinese insider here, so we're going to be talking about it a bit later. But to you, how does it feel? What does it mean to live in Singapore in these days, and to what extent it is going to change, you know, the cross-border flows and everything that comes with it?
Well, there are a couple of observations to make here. One is political, and the other might be more regional and economic. The first is that the success, at least the early success, of many Asian societies in tackling COVID was something of a validation of their models of governance, or at least the fact that they learned from the historical experience of the SARS epidemic of 2003, and the fact that there was already a high degree of trust between people and trust in the government led to, I think, some of the necessary levels of political confidence that allowed Asian countries to be more successful. So as you know, I wrote in my book, The Future is Asian, about this sort of technocratic model of governance. And of course, one of the things that I did not expect to see happen, and that finally happened, is that during this pandemic, in the West, people started to look to Asia and to say, why don't we do things as well as they are doing things? And those are, obviously born out of tragedy, of course, but it's a validation of what I've been arguing for some time. Now, Asian governments are very diverse. They are not uniform. Some are democratic, some are authoritarian, some have strong state capacity, others have weak capacity. But they certainly demonstrated a sense of solidarity, in often beyond the level that one would expect from relatively poor countries. So I think that they are getting the credit that they deserve finally. So that's one observation, that confidence is there and that confidence is growing despite the economic setback of COVID. The second observation is something that is also that really relates to a pre-pandemic trend that will accelerate, and that is regionalism economically. At the height of the pandemic, your Asian countries signed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the largest trade agreement by area, by population, by GDP in the world. And by the way, it's worth noting that North America, a similar agreement was signed, the USMCA, United States, Mexico, Canada. And of course, in Europe, you have now a fiscal compact in many ways that you did not have before. So the three major economic zones of the world have been pursuing and will deepen the pursuit of strong regionalism because of the rupture in global supply chains, the trade war, suspicions of China, and the desires for greater self-sufficiency. So Asia is going to be front and center in this regard because, of course, it has very strong industrial policies. It's modernizing very quickly. And more Asians will now stay in Asia, invest in Asia, build their companies in Asia, and so forth. And China plays a very important part in this. Even though China is technically closed for travel right now, guess whose exports are surging, right? Guess whose trade surpluses are surging? So on the one hand, you might say, look at how China has closed itself off. Asia seems to be fragmenting. But then if you look at the trade statistics, you would, of course, see a different picture. So, whether we're talking about demographics, geopolitics, economics, these are different lenses to view what's going on. And even with the very high degree of tension between China and its neighbors, they've nonetheless moved forward with RCEP. And this is evidence of one of the arguments I've often made about Asia, is that Asians are capable, at least for a substantial period of time, of balancing the economic and strategic agendas and keeping these on parallel tracks. And that's a very, very important sort of attribute right now.
You've mentioned your book, The Future is Asian. When we talked in December last year, you mentioned that originally you wanted to name the book The Present is Asian, and then you realize it might be way too controversial to use a tiny bit of a hyperbole. So you don't have to worry here. We have all the smart people. So don't be afraid to be controversial. Why is the present Asian, Parag?
Well, I think, this is not necessarily a proposition that's as controversial as some people might say. When you think about the world from a demographic standpoint, from an economic standpoint in terms of the size of economies, purchasing power parity terms, integration of Asia, the volume of intra-regional trade, finance, flows of people, all of these kinds of things. If you're sitting in Asia where I am, you don't wake up in the morning considering yourself a satellite of America or of Europe. You consider yourself the center of the world. It's not even a thought that crosses your mind. It's not a debatable proposition. So what I would suggest is we invert our Eurocentrism and we actually get used to the fact that most of the human population that is in Asia wakes up thinking of the world in no other way than that the present reality is Asian. And a corollary to that is that to be a superpower in the world today, you must be a power in Asia. If you are only a power in Europe, you are nothing but a provincial power. You're not globally relevant. If you are the United States and you are not systemically relevant in Asia, then you're just a big power on the other side of the world. You're not really a global power. So to be a global power means to be a power in Asia, relevant to Asia, operating in Asia. But the reverse is not true. An Asian power does not have to prove that it is relevant in South America or Africa to be a systemically relevant player. It only has to be relevant in Asia because Asia is the center of global demographics and the economy. So this is not just some kind of a rhetorical sleight of hand or a magic trick. This is literally how the majority of human beings on the planet Earth think. If you don't think that way, you're quite frankly in the minority. But remember, and I would say this in a friendly way, but also a blunt way, because you asked me to be controversial, I guess. But remember that no one here cares what you think. And I wrote exactly those words in my book. Put yourself in a situation, uncomfortable as it may be, in the West, to wake up in the morning wherever you are and say, there are 5 billion people east of Dubai who don't care at all what I think.
What does it mean for the world? How it's gonna change because of the rise of China? And of course, this action provokes, let's say, reaction, meaning not only because of what is going on in Asia, but also what is going on in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere.
Well, I wouldn't say that there is a sort of general Asian view, right? We have to remember this is the largest and most diverse region of the planet. More languages, more ethnicities, vaster geography, more unique civilizations. So there isn't an Asian view of the rest of the world. And let's remember that within Asia, of course, the majority of people in Asia do live in democratic states. They are not the caliber of democracy such as Germany or Canada, but they are democracies. And remember that their perspective and their priority is to improve their governance and focus on good governance, not to prove that they can live up to the American or the British ideal of democracy. All they care about here is performance, whether the performance is of a democratic state or of a quasi-democratic state. Again, that's your theoretical framework. Asian countries don't, again, Asian leaders, Asian countries don't wake up in the morning and say, oh, I only ranked 84 out of 100 according to the Economist magazine or Freedom House Index of Democracy. I will really struggle to be a better democracy today. That's not how Asians think. That's also not how they act or how they behave. They wake up in the morning and they say, I have to figure out how to do a digital subsidy system to put cash in the hands of farmers. I have to build 10 highways into these provinces. I have to sign this agreement to settle this dispute with this country. Or I have a fight going on with this country. I need to go and focus on that. So there is a very famous strategist and scenario planner here in Singapore named Peter Ho. I call him the Yoda of governance. And he says there's complaining cultures and there are problem-solving cultures. And what you find in Asia is problem-solving culture. And what we have now, what we have become, what we have degenerated into in most Western societies is complaining cultures rather than problem-solving cultures. And that's highly problematic. But it's a reminder that we need to have this balance between democracy and technocracy. I am for democracy. I am for universal mandatory voting. I, like Greta Thunberg, would like to see people age 16 vote. I want to see lifelong mandatory voting for everyone in the world in every country that they are in. But that is not a substitute for governance. It's not a substitute for strong public institutions, for strong state capacity, for educated, competent, independent public servants, and all of the things that you see in places like Singapore, Japan, and elsewhere.
Now let's, before I actually give our distinguished audience a chance to ask questions, let's focus on, we just focus on a global level. Let's focus on, let's say, individual players level and on countries you labeled the second word in your, if I'm not mistaken, your second book. Let's focus on small open economies such as the Czech Republic. What does it mean that the present is Asian, that the world is changing because of it, and of course the rules of the game are changing as well? How they should cope, how should they thrive, if you will?
Well, let me answer in two ways. First of all, in terms of rules of the game, I'm very glad you mentioned this. One of the accomplishments of Asia's rise has been to put certain issues on the agenda that had been neglected for a long time. Think about, for example, infrastructure finance. Western governments, Western leaders, Western-led institutions like the World Bank and others ignored the importance of infrastructure and infrastructure finance for about 60 years. And during that 60-year period, the world population tripled. And that's a absolutely unforgivable oversight, right? It clearly shows incompetence and lack of concern for the ground realities of billions of people around the world. Even our development institutions were asleep for 50 years on this issue. It required Japanese leadership and now Chinese leadership to put infrastructure finance very high up on the global agenda. So much so that it has now been included in the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. Infrastructure is now one of the SDGs. That would not have happened if America were the only voice dictating global norms and dictating what is a public good. So that's one example. Now, of course, I still believe that Europe is the world's normative leader in terms of setting, the agenda, the rules, living up to the expectations that we have. And Europe has done a lot for everything from human rights to data privacy, also infrastructure, judicial reform, countless areas. As you know very well, we've known each other a long time. I'm the most pro-European Asian American there is. But the rise of Asia has, in this normative sense, been very important, right? Because of this emphasis on infrastructure. And there's other examples like that. Now, this has also created a gravity around itself, around Asia, that has attracted second world countries, emerging markets, ascending countries, fragile states, frontier markets, whatever term you want to use for these countries, because they see that a membership in the Belt and Road Initiative, or a membership in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or trade agreements with Asian countries are going to lead to large volumes of flows of exchange, trade relationships, investment, and so forth, that are going to speak to the specific needs that these countries have. And that's precisely what has been happening for the past 10 or 15 years. And just to be clear, it has been going on for that long. As I started traveling specifically to all of these frontier markets and emerging markets and second world countries in the early and mid 2000s, this is what I was seeing, is this gravitational pull of Asia, China in particular, Asia in general. And that is as strong as ever the further we look into the future.
Are there any questions, ladies and gentlemen? Okay, if not, last question, Parag, and that is, I know this is a hardcore crystal ball prediction, but to you, given what we know, and we know that we don't know, how 2030 is going to look like? To what extent, in what aspects, it's going to be business as usual, and where will the biggest differences are going to be?
Well, I would maintain that the world is going to remain a multipolar and multi-civilizational system. And again, that's absolutely unique in history from a durable standpoint. One can only point to one brief period in global history where you had a global multipolarity, and that's the rise of Japan. But Japan technically was not a global power at the time. It was able to attack Pearl Harbor, of course, and it made an attempt to colonize and conquer East Asia, the Pacific Rim. But it was not, in truth, a global power with global power projection capability. So now you have Asia, which has, not only China, which is a global power, but multiple great powers such as Japan, India, and others. So you have a multipolar world in which the United States, in particular North America in general, is a very robust continental superpower. You have the European Union that continues to expand, to widen and deepen. And you have Asia, and within Asia, multiple powers. So a multipolar Asia within a multipolar world is a very unique geopolitical landscape, which is unique in world history. And that's where we are right now, and we will still be there in 2030. In fact, even more so, because you could see North America actually deepening its internal connectivity, which will absolutely strengthen the North American continent. There's no doubt about it. Make no mistake. Even with Trump as previous president under Biden today, whoever comes next, there are structural forces underway in North America that are very positive. And then, of course, I'm quite confident in Europe. Europe is much better suited to adapt to climate change, actually, than the United States is. America's advantage in the future will be to be near Canada. So we have to think in mega regional terms. So we will have this, again, tri-regional kind of system. And I think that's actually quite healthy. So that's one major dimension of the world of 2030. But of course, we'll have even more seamless connectivity in many ways, even if you have geopolitical tensions that are persistent. The fact is that given the technologies I was mentioning earlier, such as a passport on your mobile phone, and the number of internet cables that are being laid down around the world, and efforts among countries to come to some kind of an agreement about data regulation, data privacy, harmonization, these kinds of things. I don't really believe that there is a bipolar new Cold War around technology where everyone has to choose a Chinese standard or an American standard. That's absolutely ludicrous. And nothing of the sort is going on in the world today. Even if you're purchasing Huawei or not purchasing Huawei, the fact is that countries are very, very strict and adamant about their own privacy standards, not adopting a Chinese standard, but having their own standard. And you can see this all across Asia, where governments say, we're happy to take Chinese investment from Alibaba or Tencent or whatever the case may be, but we're not letting our data get stocked away and sent to Beijing. That's not what's happening here. Those same companies in this region are taking Japanese investment, American investment, and Chinese investment at the same time. So we live in a self-interested world, and I think that's a very good thing. Because what that means is that countries are saying, we know what China wants, but we won't give it to them. We will get what we need from China and not give China what China wants unless they pay a very, very heavy price. And that's the new psychology of the post-Cold War world, of the post-colonial world, and a world that is very suspicious of neo-mercantile practices. So I believe we're heading in a fairly healthy direction. And my biggest fear, quite frankly, is climate change. One can fear geopolitical dilemmas and confrontations and conflicts every day. And I do as well, because I live here in the zone of maximum volatility. But it is not every day that a war is breaking out. And when there is a war, and there will be perhaps a war over Taiwan, over the South China Sea, the Senkaku Islands, there will be a war. And that does not invalidate the Asia thesis. It means that these frictions are going to be resolved either violently or peacefully, but the system will remain intact and it will move on after that war. There will be a winner and there will be a loser, as there always are in wars. But climate change worries me because you have such a high number of people who are exposed to climate change in this region. Again, it's the most populous region, but also the most exposed to floods, to droughts, to heat waves, and rising sea levels. And there isn't a collective adaptation strategy. And that's true of Asia, it's true of the whole world. So in 2030, we will be much more climate stressed than we are today. And the world will become ever more starkly divided into livable and unlivable zones, which is why I wrote this book, Move, to kind of forecast what is going to potentially happen in terms of new vectors of migration. Now, that is a tragedy in the making. At the same time, it is a phenomenon or a lens through which to view who the winners and losers are of the 21st century. Because the winning societies are the ones that are attracting people, particularly young people, to replenish their demographics, to diversify their economies, and so forth. So even amidst the sense of desperation of refugee flows and migrants and so forth, the fact is that if a country is absorbing people, then it is a sign of its vitality, and it can use those people and make them sort of pillars of its future economy. So in some ways, one of the lessons of classical geopolitics is alive and well, which is that collecting people is collecting power.
Parag Khanna. Parag, thank you very much. Very interesting talk indeed. I'll see you again. Take care.
Wonderful to see you. Thank you, everyone.
Dámy a pánové, děkuji. Slibuji, že další online, a vy to samozřejmě víte, nebudeme vás trápit. Vše ostatní, co se zde bude dít, tak se bude dít přímo zde a tady. Teď půl hodina pro ty z vás, kteří nestihli občerstvit se před tímto panelem, tak možnost tak učinit, napravit. Za půl hodiny budeme volně pokračovat s profesorem Tuzem. Některé motivy, které zde zazněly, tak přebereme, další otevřeme, tak aby jsme se dostali postupně k tomu, co z vás většinu, předpokládám, zajímá nejvíc, to znamená, co to vlastně znamená pro nás, lidi, kteří zde v České republice žijí, působí, nějakou dobu ještě předpokládám, že budou aspoň někteří z nás. Příjemné občerstvení, za půl hodiny se těším.